Ghosts, or the paranormal, has always interested people over the centuries. As children growing up in South Africa, we were told mythologies or tales or ghost stories that were passed down from one generation to another by the adults in our lives. Particularly on a cold Cape winter's night, after the sun has set, the adults would caution us not to venture outside by telling us these ghost stories. The myth was that when we do venture outside in the cold and dark, the disembodied spirits of those who have died would follow us home and torment or haunt or terrorize us in our sleep. The English language has plenty of works that has the paranormal as a subject matter. In modern entertainment, we have movies such as The Ghostbusters. We have television series called Ghosts. Even in ancient or at least classic English literature, we have works that has the paranormal as its subject matter. Such an example would be a Christmas Carol that was authored by Charles Dickens. In this classic novel, the disembodied spirit of Jacob Marley takes on the form of the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come. And these paranormal appearances visits a man by the name of Ebenezer Scrooge, who was the business partner to the late Jacob Marley. The goal of these appearances was to motivate Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge to change his miserly, self-centered lifestyle to a more generous and giving person. These appearances happened on the night before Christmas. Ghosts are believed, according to the mythology, to be spirits of the deceased who are thought to exist in the realm that intersects the living world. One of the unexpected places to find any references to ghosts would be in the New Testament. In our text in the previous section, we spoke about Jesus walking on water. That is in Mark chapter 6, verses 45 to 48. We are told that Jesus saw that his disciples in verse 48 were making painful progress or torturous progress because the wind was against them. And Jesus steps onto the surface of the water to go to his disciples, and that incident is told from the point of view of Jesus, what he saw and what he did based on what he saw. In the next section of the same incident, that is from Mark chapter 6, verses 49 to 52, that walking on the water is told from the perspective of the disciples. What did they see and how did they react based on what they saw? We know from the previous episode that Jesus saw that his disciples were struggling and were in desperate need of rescue. And so he made haste to reach them, even if it meant walking on water. In the next section, which I will read in a few seconds, is that we will look at that same phenomena of Jesus walking on water, but from the point of view of the 12 men who were in the boat, making their way to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And so we read, "When they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately Jesus spoke with them and said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished. And then Mark gives us a commentary. For they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves. And the reason, according to Mark, for their hearts were hardened. What did the disciples see, and what did they do based on what they saw? Verse 49, and they saw him walking on the sea, or walking on the water. And what did they do? They interpreted his appearance as being a phantom or a ghost. From the disciples' point of view, they saw this mysterious figure walking on water and appearing to make much better progress than what they had been making, in spite of their muscle power and years of experience of making a living from the water, from the Sea of Galilee. But when they saw him, they interpreted his appearance as being a ghost or a paranormal, a disembodied spirit, and they responded by being terrified. They did not recognize the figure that was walking right next to them while they were battling the elements. And so they did not recognize the figure as Jesus, but then he identifies himself using the words ergo emi, which simply means it is I, because they were scared, because common knowledge told them that human beings cannot walk on water, and according to their pagan philosophy, weightless ghosts can walk on water. But they had to learn that ghosts, we know, come to terrorize, they come to torment, they come to haunt people, but they cannot and does not, according to the mythology, reassure them. And so disciples should have put the two concepts together. It cannot be a phantom, as Mark described it, because a phantom, a ghost, does not reassure them. And so they cried out based on what they saw, and Mark tells us, for they all saw him, and they were terrified. The him here obviously refers to Jesus, but the disciples, in spite of being with him now for more than a year and a half, they interpreted his appearance as being a phantom or being a ghost. So we have insight into the disciples' thinking, and also we get a glimpse on their spiritual development. They were caught between what they were learning while being with Jesus to what they had been told when they were children, that there exist ghosts on the Sea of Galilee. And so when they did not identify him, they went to what they were told, and they thought he was a ghost. And Mark tells us, and they were terrified. And so what did Jesus do instead of in reaction to his disciples' reaction? And we are told in verse 50 and verse 51, while they were shouting out, while they were terrified, immediately he spoke to them and said to them, "Be courageous," or "do not be afraid, be of good cheer," according to the ancient translations. "It is I, do not fear." And what Jesus does there is that he seeks to encourage his disciples while at the same time he's trying to calm their fears with an immediate word of reassurance. Have courage. He identifies himself to his disciples by encouraging them with his voice. But he uses a very interesting term. He says, it is I, in the original text, ergo eimi, and says, stop being afraid. And that is a clue that Mark is giving us as to what Jesus is doing in order to teach his disciples a very important lesson concerning his person and ministry. The words, it is I, or ergo eimi, literally means I am. And it's the same phrase that Moses heard when God first introduces himself to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. Moses is in the desert, as we know. He's taking care of animals as a shepherd. It's not uncommon in the desert to have thorn bushes catch alight spontaneously and self-combust. But in this case, Moses is drawn to this unusual sight because even though the bush is burning, it's not being consumed by the flames. And so Moses goes to investigate this abnormal occurrence. And God talks to Moses and said to Moses, take off your shoes, for you are on holy ground. And then God identifies himself as I am. He says, Moses, I want you to go to a man called Pharaoh and tell them I am sent you. And Moses had to take on this very difficult task, and all he had was the assurance that the presence of God would be with him as he take on the mightiest man on the face of the earth, and that was the Pharaoh of the day. And Jesus uses the same terminology when he assures his disciples that it is him, and he uses the term, it is I, or I am, and it was meant to assure his disciples that the God of the Old Testament, the Yahweh, who gave assurances to Moses when he took on the mightiest man in the world with his mighty army, the I am that was with Moses is the same I am that is with them while he is manifesting himself in the person of Jesus Christ. And that was meant to serve as a form of encouragement in spite of the adverse circumstances and in spite of the confusion of having a figure, a person walking on the face of water. That person is not a ghost. They misidentified him as a ghost, and Jesus assures them, he says, no, you are not seeing a ghost. You are seeing the I am of the Old Testament. And so what we have is a reassurance of the disciples that the God of the Old Testament is present with them even in the midst of their adverse circumstances. And the reason why it is here is that the readers that read the original text, when Mark wrote this down to the church in Rome, they were being persecuted because of their faith. They were hiding in the graveyards, in the catacombs, and they were facing adverse circumstances, and he was assuring them that the I am that was with Moses back then is the same I am that is with the disciples, and it's the same I am that is with them as they face adverse circumstances. In other words, Jesus is comforting his disciples in the midst of distress and turmoil. And even though they misidentify him as a ghost, in spite of the exposure that they had, being at the front seat of the miracles and being the subject of the teachings of Jesus, they did not understand And so they misidentified him as a phantom or as a ghost. And Jesus, after he identifies himself as the I am of the Old Testament, we are told in verse 51, and he climbed up to them in the boat, and the wind ceased. And now we read, they were very amazed. Now their emotions move from terrifying to being amazed, and Mark gives us the reason why. For they did not understand about the bread, but their hearts have been hardened. Only when Jesus joins the disciples in the boat does the storm subside. The presence of Jesus and his entrance into the boat results in the wind coming to an end. In Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41, the disciples are in a similar situation. Jesus this time is sleeping in the boat. The disciples wake him and says, Master or teacher, do you not care that we will perish? And Jesus gets up and he rebukes the wind to be still. But here, his simple presence was enough to cause the wind to stop blowing. And so we are told, and in the light of this transformation of stormy seas to a mirror smooth sea surface or water surface, the disciples were utterly astonished. And Mark tells us they were very or exceedingly astonished. And he combines those two adverbs to explain to us the extent of their response to Jesus bringing the wind and the storms to an end simply by his presence. They were very and exceedingly astonished. And so what disciples had to realize is that separation from Jesus, as he compelled them to climb into the boat, resulted in distress. The presence of Jesus overcomes the storms in their lives. And the response of the disciples to this event and to their rescue was one of perplexity and bewilderment. And the word that Mark tells us there is that they were astonished. They were out of their mind with fear. So they were moving from one extreme to the other, one of identifying him in spite of their privileged position as being a subject and being privileged to the teachings and an eyewitness to his miracles. They went from exceedingly afraid to be out of their mind in fear. They could not process what they were experiencing. So Mark tells us the reason for their variety of emotions is because they gained no insight from the feeding of the 5,000. And the question that we need to ask is, what did they had to learn which they have missed from the feeding episode? And in that episode, Jesus shows himself as the one who is the shepherd from God, who is able to feed his hungry masses. That Jesus, the true shepherd, provides for his sheep's needs so that they would lack nothing. In that episode, Jesus took a poor man's meal and multiplied it to satisfy the need of the masses. And so what he was doing there is that he was revealing another layer to his person, that Jesus is the true shepherd who provides for the needs of his sheep. And as the true shepherd, and now as he intervenes in the distress of his disciples, he does not abandon his disciples or his sheep to their dreadful circumstances, but he will minister to their needs at the greatest point of desperation, The lesson that they had to learn and they did not learn is that Jesus is the true shepherd who would intervene in the lives of his disciples at the greatest point of stress, and he will release and relieve them from their duress and from their stressful situation. And because the disciples did not learn that lesson, they responded to Jesus walking on water in a dreadful way by misidentifying him as a ghost. And then they substituted faith in him with fear of him. And Mark tells us that they were temporarily out of their minds, for they were greatly afraid, or they were astounded, they were astonished, they were beside themselves. And the lesson that they had to learn, and the lesson that we need to learn, is that we need to continue to place our confidence in Christ, because he's a true shepherd who will not only satisfy the needs of his followers, but he is the shepherd who will minister to his followers at their greatest point of desperation. And unfortunately, Mark tells us that they had to learn this lesson, but they did not learn it immediately because their hearts were hardened. Later on, Jesus will remove the hardness of their heart, but for now, the lesson that they had to learn was Jesus is the true shepherd who not only feed the masses and does not send his sheep away unsatisfied. He is the true shepherd who will intervene in the lives of his followers at the greatest point of desperation. And his presence will result in either the calmness of the circumstances, or it will result in the calmness on the internal side of his disciples. The disciples replaced faith in him with fear of him, and therefore the storm was happening not only on the outside, the storm was happening on the inside of their lives. But yet we have this assurance, do not be afraid, it is I. The God that was with Moses in the Old Testament when Moses took on Pharaoh is a God that is with the disciples as they were battling and making torturous progress, and his very presence in the form of Jesus Christ results in the removal of the storm. And we read, and the storm abated. And the storm abated not only on the outside, the storm abated on the inside of these men. In other words, God was telling them through the appearance of Jesus, continue to place your focus and your confidence in him, because he's a true shepherd. He is the true shepherd who will not abandon his sheep to their adverse circumstances, but his very presence, the I am, will result in the stilling of the storm on the outside, or the stilling of the storm on the inside. And therefore they needed to continue to place their confidence in him.